I think the reason why I've been invited to chair this panel, which is about planning for people and the changing role of culture, museum and the arts for wider society, is because a lot of my research has focused around the idea of the social impacts of the arts and culture and how that has been a motivation for policy and a justification for funding and all the issues of trying to evidence that. Because of course I suspect that whilst in this room, wanting to hazard a guess, we probably all believe in the transformative power of the arts and the power of creative experiences and arts experiences, translating that into the kind of evidence that can be a driver for policy it's quite a challenge. And I think the sector as a whole has a long way to go, even though from the day that I started as a MA researcher, and a student work around social impact of the arts, massive, we've come a long way, but there's still a long way to go. So I'm looking forward to see what our speakers today have to tell us. And the beauty of this grouping of people is that they all come from very different organisations and have very different perspectives, so that's going to be fascinating. So I quite like the approach of the first panel of the day, so I'll just tell you who our speakers are, and then we'll leave it to them to introduce themselves. So we have Georgina Holmes-Skelton, who's the Head of Government Affairs at the National Trust. We have Gail Boyle, who's the Senior Curator at Bristol Culture, Max Patton, who's the Executive Director of Public Policy and Communication at Arts Council England, and then we have John Martin, who's the Artistic Director of Pan Intercultural Arts. So we've got a range of perspective from the funders to the funded, to the creatives, and I think that will make for a really interesting set of conversation. My suggestion is that we follow the same structure that we did for the morning panel, which seemed to work very well. Our speaker will come, talk to us for their 20 minutes, and then we will bring them all here onto the stage so we can all have a conversation about the issues that they raised. Does that sound like a plan? Excellent. So I think we follow the order here on the printout, and we start with Georgina from National Trust.
So firstly, apologies, I meant to bring some nice National Trust pictures that I could put up and show you all, but I ran out of time towards the end, so I'm just going to speak, but you can maybe imagine some beautiful landscapes and buildings as I go. So I'm Head of Government Affairs at the National Trust. I'm feeling a little bit like an imposter actually in this group, because I don't really come from a heritage background at all. I'm not an archaeologist or a planner. My background before I joined the Trust is very much in Westminster and Whitehall. I come from a sort of policy, a scrutiny of it, making of it, legislation, how that works sort of background. I joined the Trust just in February this year, so I'm still learning about the minutiae of heritage policy and what you do. But I'm hoping that some of my thoughts from that slight outsider perspective might give a slightly different note to the discussion we can have. So I hope that's of value to everyone. So the Trust is obviously an organisation with a really broad interest in public policy. I mean, obviously we care for a really wide range of historic buildings and heritage assets, from those huge Georgian mansions and estates to Paul McCartney's small suburban childhood home in Liverpool. But we also manage and care for a lot of countryside, key habitat, coastlines, farms, villages, businesses, you name it. I'm still finding new things almost every day that we look after. My government affairs team is one of those that sees a little bit of all of those things in the Trust. And we try, not always completely successfully, but we try to keep on top of the different things that are going on across that really broad range of activity. We work with colleagues and stakeholders from all over the organisation, and from across a range of sectors as well. And what's been particularly interesting for me to see over the last few months has been the different areas of policy being at quite different places in terms of political engagement and awareness, and also in terms of public understanding and how people relate to these different policies. I think there's some interesting comparisons to make and lessons that can be shared between the sectors, and that's something that I'd like to spend some time doing today. looking particularly at the environment and the heritage sectors, and hopefully this will follow on quite nicely from the information we heard about the Woodland Trust's work earlier today. So I'm going to start talking a little bit about the natural environment. And I think it's fair to say that there's been a real sea change over the last few years in terms of that particular policy area. What was a little bit of a niche concern, if you think back to about 15 years ago, has become really mainstream. We've seen in the last few years the coming together of the green sector with a real clarity of voice, and both the government and the public have responded to that. We saw earlier this year the publication of the 25-year environment plan, and we've also seen, as we heard earlier, the government's proposals for an environmentally centred replacement to the EU's Common Agricultural Policy. And we've also got a commitment to an environment bill. So together, these government public policy proposals, if implemented effectively, and I acknowledge there is perhaps some distance to bridge between the promise that we have and the reality that we might see, but assuming they are implemented as we'd like, they have the potential to deliver much of what the environment sector has been calling for years. And we've also seen the public engage in these issues. I mean, if you think about things like plastic waste, it feels like there's a real collective energy and desire to see change. I haven't been able to find any specific statistics about the general plastics use or recycling levels over the last year quite yet, but I did find that searches on Google for terms like ways to reduce plastic waste increased by 1,000% between December last year and April this year. 1,000%, that's huge. And again, government policy is having a real impact in that area, and the 5p charge on plastic bags introduced last year led to an 86% fall in the number of new plastic bag sales. So again, we're seeing public consciousness and government policy in a very similar place. And that hasn't happened by accident by any means, and I think there's a good few factors involved. Certainly the urgency of need has become much clearer and better understood, both in terms of the evidence that we have about the speed of deterioration for the state of nature, but also as a result of Brexit, which has driven a real need for political engagement with these issues, but also an opportunity for significant policy change. The extremely hard work of a lot of committed people in the sector has helped to create structures and the momentum to bring the sector together and to speak with more of a common voice on some of these really pressing issues. And it's allowed us to deliver a really genuinely shared and positive vision for the change that we need to see on some of the really hard issues that the government is facing. For example, like replacing the Common Agricultural Policy, which is hugely complicated with lots of different stakeholders and outcomes that need to be seen. The likes of Sir David Attenborough must be given quite a bit of credit, I think, for helping to create an emotional connection as well, showing people the consequence of their use of plastic, for example. And it's not just helped people understand what's being lost, but it's related it to their everyday lives. People watching the show last year took great pleasure in seeing nature in action and all the wonderful animals, but then they were shown the relevance of their own behaviour for nature in return. And I think anyone who watched that programme, certainly I, felt really quite guilty, actually, when you see those pictures and you think to yourself that there is something that you could be doing about that. And I think it's also fair to say that, particularly over the last year, the real impact of climate change is beginning to become really visible in the weather, and that definitely helps. But altogether, as a result, what we have is a mature and well-understood narrative around the state of the natural environment. The value of it to everyone is generally accepted and understood, I would suggest, and I think the degree of public engagement in particular has helped create political space and momentum to introduce policy that makes a real difference. It's moved the discussion around the state of the natural environment from the political fringe to a situation where the current Conservative government and the Secretary of State is bringing forward significant policy proposals and talking about the UK becoming a world leader in this space. For the Trust, the development of clarity of message around environmental policy was a process that the whole sector has been part of, but we've had our own journey too as an organisation, and we've been through a process of reflecting on our cause in relation to the natural environment and thinking about what we want to see change to help preserve nature and the animals and plant lives that our founders valued. And we've thought a bit about what the nation needs from us in terms of achieving that. And as a result, we have much greater clarity now than we did a few years ago about the part that we want to play in that picture. And that means we've been able to communicate our vision much more confidently and play a much more active role in the sector-wide movement. So, to turn now to the heritage side, I think it's fair to say that the public policy conversation isn't in quite the same place. There are plenty of challenges and policy asks that we have, and we've heard about some of those earlier. And there are certainly things to be alarmed about in relation to the state of the historic environment. But I'd suggest that we haven't yet seen the same coalescing of people, of evidence, public engagement around the heritage cause, and we haven't quite reached that collective understanding of the impact for people and that clarity of message and political urgency that necessitates a response. There isn't yet quite that same shared sense of vision for change that we're seeing on the natural environment side that can help drive a popular movement behind the historic environment. Of course, that hasn't always been the case, and the roots of the National Trust particularly are very much embedded in the desire to protect our historic environment as much as the natural environment. The Trust was founded in the belief that our heritage and the historic buildings and assets around us are important to people and that they have a positive impact on their lives and therefore should be preserved for future generations. And this preservation movement led to the Trust as it is now, with the number of special places that we look after on behalf of the nation. The historic environment is as fundamental to our work as the natural environment, and we want to see it regain some of that prominence in terms of public policy discussion and political interest. So the challenge is, how do we go about rekindling that conversation and sparking that passion that can drive a movement? And thinking about our organisational journey as well, for us at the National Trust, the question is going to be, what is our role going forward? How can we conserve and get the most out of what we have and the places that we look after for the nation, but also how can we support the country more broadly to protect its heritage? What are we trying to achieve, actually, for the public through the cultural offer that our places deliver? And how do we maximise the benefit for people from our heritage? What does that look like? And then, from that, what should we be asking for in terms of public policy to help us support that? Now, there's been a lot of work and research over recent years to understand the value that heritage can offer to society. And as a result, I would suggest that we actually have quite a lot of evidence already of the good that heritage can do, beyond being a good thing in and of itself. And I'm going to refer to some of Duncan's Heritage Counts work here as well. In terms of economic benefit, the Historic England estimate is that heritage tourism, for example, generated 16.4 billion in spending by domestic and international visitors in 2016. And it's thought that for every £1 spent as part of a heritage visit, 32p of that is spent on the actual site itself, with the remaining 68p spent in local businesses, restaurants, cafes, hotels, shops and the like. So that impact goes much wider in terms of the benefit of historic buildings and urban quarters for hosting businesses, offering community on creative spaces, and places that people want to live in. We know that heritage drives tourism, it creates jobs, it supports other sectors as well, such as construction, film, and also the wider creative industries. But I'd suggest that even more importantly than the economic element is what heritage can do for people. And last year we published a piece of research that we undertook alongside the University of Surrey called Places That Make Us. This found evidence of the physiological impact of place on people and the ability of place to positively impact on our well-being. Visiting somewhere that's special to you can actually create measurable changes in your brain, believe it or not, and generate a positive emotional response. It can boost feelings like calmness or joy. And that's not just something that you get from revisiting, say, somewhere that you visited and enjoyed as a child, but it's also about the places here and now that give you something of value. That's a space to reflect, or somewhere that's particularly beautiful, or somewhere that you can just go to be with your friends and family. They all can generate that response. Work being done by others in the sector is also contributing to the growing evidence of the wider health and well-being benefits associated with the historic environment. So we know that people who regularly visit heritage sites are statistically more likely to have higher measures of happiness and life satisfaction and lower levels of anxiety. The historic environment also provides opportunities for direct interventions, and the move towards social prescribing helping people with issues like loneliness or mental health through things like getting involved directly in archaeology, for example, or through gardening or other forms of group activities that can be facilitated by our heritage assets is a really good example of that. There's also some evidence, though this might be an interesting area to do some more work on, around social cohesion. And we know that volunteering and opportunities to get involved in community projects around heritage can certainly help bring people together from different backgrounds. Historic buildings and heritage sites help create distinctiveness and identity of place, which can help create that shared sense of identity and community for the people who live there. And heritage sites themselves can also offer really effective spaces to host community activities. I live in Reading myself, and over the last year I've seen the reopening and after the restoration of the Reading Abbey. And that, over the course of the last year, has provided a really great place for all kinds of activities. I've seen theatre, music, pop-up bars, events. I even saw library sessions for kids being held in the Abbey grounds. It's a really great example of what can be done. So that potential community value of heritage and the benefits that it can offer is really, really significant. And in a nation of increasing inequality, perhaps, with increasing political division, the need to find common ground and shared experience becomes ever greater. And our shared stories and heritage can be one of those things that can help with that. So if heritage can deliver all of these sorts of benefits, then surely it should have real potential to address some of these really big issues facing society. If it can do that, surely it must be a complete no-brainer to be supporting it. But we've not really seen that potential bear fruit yet for the sector. And it's a really interesting sort of dichotomy. People seem to like heritage. Millions of people visit heritage sites like our trust sites every year. They watch historical dramas and TV programmes like Downton Abbey and Poldark. And if asked, people will say that they value it. A recent survey found 71% of people are interested in their local history. And a huge 94.2% of people agree that it's important to look after heritage buildings and places. But still, there isn't yet that same sense of energy and drive behind heritage as a public good that we've seen for the natural environment. We're not seeing a clamouring quite yet for a People's March for Heritage, like the one we saw just a few weeks ago for nature, for example. And we've not really yet seen government policy shift substantially to take advantage of those potential benefits. I think the key to this lies in how the public perceives heritage and the political space that the concept of heritage occupies. For a great many people, if you were to ask them what they think of when you say the word heritage, for quite a lot of them, they would say something like a castle or a historic house. At least that's the case for the unscientific sample of people that I know. And for us at the Trust, the perennial challenge is not just to be about the huge Georgian country estates, which is still what a lot of people think about when they think of the Trust. And certainly those are important to us and to the nation. But it's important to understand that this image of heritage doesn't fully represent everyone. This image is by nature exclusionary. It feels in the realm of the rural, aristocratic, white landowner, and lots of people simply just don't see themselves in that kind of heritage asset. And the conventional view of history that it invokes isn't truly shared. It's too dominated by narratives that just don't speak from the perspectives of contemporary audiences. And for many, it might be a great place to visit, really fun to dip into how the other half lived, but it doesn't speak to people's contemporary day-to-day lives. And in 2018, it's possibly not surprising, therefore, that politicians might back away from policy that may be perceived as propping up what's perceived to be that narrow, wealthy, largely white, older landowning interest. Now, obviously, the places and the collections that we care for have much more diverse histories than that, and we work really hard through our public programming and interpretation to try to tell stories from a range of perspectives and experiences, embracing stories from all classes, races, and identities of modern Britain. But cutting through that instinctive, exclusionary impression isn't easy. And the challenge of forever for everyone is something that we need to work really hard to live up to. And I think for the historic environment and built elements of place particularly, there are also some challenges around ownership and identity. For a younger generation particularly, who can't afford to buy and perhaps are regularly moving around as a result of short-term rents, I think the built environment can feel rather remote. It's again something that belongs to other people. It's aspirational, possibly quite nice to visit, but not something fundamentally within their control. And I can understand why preserving it could be seen as a luxury as a result, and quite a long way down the priority list. If you don't have a stake in something, why should you stand up for it? The title, though, of this session, Planning for People, I think is really important. It places people at the centre of the discussion. Thinking about heritage in particular can be really easy to fall, I think, into the trap of forgetting that heritage isn't all about bricks and mortar, objects in glass cases, things buried in the ground, or even getting feet through the door. It's actually the people who are key. Saving a building from demolition or from change past the point of recognition is important not because the building itself is going to thank us. It's important because of the impact that it has on the people who interact with that building and the landscape around it, and whether that's either directly by visiting or living in it or working in that building or simply by walking past it every day. It's that interaction that has value to people. It affects how they think and how they feel, and it helps form identity for individuals and for whole communities. And essentially I'm saying that I think heritage gives, people give heritage its value. So I think the lessons to learn, just to summarise, is from the environmental sector are, I would suggest, twofold. Firstly, I think we need to have greater clarity over our collective message as a sector. If we can speak with clearer voice about what we think heritage can give people. But more crucially, I think, is the second point, and that's that we need to help people find that emotional connection with heritage as something that's important to their lives and that they feel they have a stake in. Something that they recognise that they're taking enjoyment and benefit from. And to do that, I think we need to find more ways to take heritage to the people we think it can help and make it relevant to their lives. If people give heritage its value, they are in turn, to my mind, the key to success in terms of heritage as a public policy issue. And the more we can demonstrate value to people of all types of backgrounds, the more we can help communities feel involved in local heritage, have a real sense of ownership of their quality of place and shared history, the more that will help generate positivity for the heritage sector as a whole. I think we need to create that space for policymakers and for politicians to start to see heritage as part of the solution, rather than just a nice-to-have item or even a problematic call on public money. So to conclude, I think we're in the midst perhaps of a bit of a transition. We're not at the start of this journey by any means, and we've made a really significant start, I think, as a sector, particularly in terms of addressing some of the key issues around diversity and inclusion. And we're learning more and more all the time about the potential of heritage and what it can deliver in terms of benefits to individuals and to society as a whole. But there's still a lot to be done, and perhaps what we need to reflect on a little bit more is creating that coherence between what we think we can offer, what people actually need, and how we reach them. I think essentially we must give people a reason to reassess their understanding of heritage and buy into a really clear vision for its future role in society. Thank you.
And everybody knows the story of Canute being the person that's supposed to have tried to hold back the tide. And sometimes as a museum curator that deals with lots of archaeological archives that derive from the planning process, that's how I feel, that I'm standing there trying to hold back the tide of everything that's being produced and trying to find somewhere to put it and not doing very well in the process. My biography is in the booklet, but I just thought I'd like to start by saying what I feel my role and what other roles that museum archaeologists have to play today. So I've got to say straight away, I am an archaeology curator. I look after everything from the Paleolithic to the present day that comes out of the ground. It's mostly broken. So it's not the really fancy stuff that people see behind cases. It's lots of stuff in boxes that people use in other ways. So it doesn't always have that added attraction. I am an archaeologist by training. I have a degree in archaeology. I've trained in museum practitioner, etc., etc. But for me, archaeology is not just about the archaeology. Archaeology in museums is about the ways that we can use our material to inspire people to become engaged with it. And that's in a way of their choosing. I do not sit here and say, you must be an archaeologist, you must learn something about the past. If they want to be creative with it, that's fine. My role is to act as an enabler, a facilitator, somebody who enriches people's lives with the collections that we actually have. talking about the Society for Museum of Archaeology, which I am the chair, I need to say straight away, quite a lot of us who work in the subject specialist networks that are recognised by Arts Council England are volunteers. Our organisation predates that epithet, specialist subject network. We've been in existence for over 40 years. And we've got 225-ish members when I looked the other day. Some of those are institutional, some of those are individuals, some come from overseas. Not all of them are professional museum archaeologists. They are people who have an interest. In fact, we changed our name so that we were more inclusive of people who wanted to join in with engaging with our subject. And we collaborate with a very wide variety of other organisations. Last year, I did a lecture as part of our annual conference, and I thought it would be a good idea at that particular point in time to look at what we've been doing for the last 40 years and whether SMA had actually ever been a catalyst for change during that time. And when I started to read the newsletters that had been produced during that period of time, it did come to me that I might actually turn this into a quiz and just take the dates off the bottom of the quotes and ask people at what point they thought some of these quotes came from. And this was the one that struck me the most to start off with. So this is one of the earliest newsletters. In the same newsletter, this is 1979, so we are talking nearly 40 years ago, the same newsletter, there was an article by Gareth Davis, who was the keeper of St Albans Museum at the time, which was called Museums and Archaeology, a Lost Cause, ? And that was then published, and this is a little abstract of it, so if you just excuse me while I read this. Is the museum archaeologist merely the caretaker of a warehouse? Why do archaeologists draw up important policy statements without mentioning the possible contribution of museums? Clearly, if museums are to regain in British archaeology the role they lost by failing to respond to the rescue crisis, they must adopt more positive attitudes to collection policies, particularly with rescue excavation material and treasure hunting, and must acquire a firmer voice in local planning decisions. So clearly I would expect that most people would understand that by now museum archaeologists aren't just caretakers of that material, but evidence suggests that we don't do very well at articulating what we actually do. So I just thought I'd show you this picture because it's one of my most favourite pictures that relates to a site in Bristol. So this is the excavation. It is a real excavation that involved children in 1948. It was a Roman villa site which was found in advance of the development of a large council housing estate post-war. The system didn't exist then that we have today in terms of planning control. We had a young teenage boy called George Boone, who was 18 at the time, at school, sixth former, who'd become interested in some of the diggers that had been digging up one of the local sites, and he wrote in to then the City Engineers Department in Bristol and asked if he could have permission to follow the diggers to see what he could find. And him and his friend John Clevedon Brown stumbled along the flue which led to this bath, which is the warm bath, the tepid bath of a Roman villa site, which is now called King's Western Roman Villa. And he got permission to dig the site, and he dug the site with amateurs, and he did it with children from the local school, and these are some of those children. Now, I use this to demonstrate the relationship, not just between planning and archaeology as it is today, and was then, but also the relationship between archaeology and the practice that museums were involved in at the time, because it was the museum committee that fought for this site to be preserved. It was the museum committee that now acquired the land. The row of houses that were supposed to go straight through the middle of it were never built. They were rooted around the outside of it, and it was preserved in situ. It had mosaics, it had the remains of a bath suite. It is still there. I'm responsible for curating it. If you want to go, you can collect a key anytime the museum is open and let yourself in. This could never happen today, and I want to contrast that with something that happened just a couple of years ago with new housing that was being built on a local site. The local community were told there's a Roman site, we think it's a villa, we'll do lots of community engagement, and that's the last they heard of it. The museum did not know about this until the press came to us and asked us what was found from the site. we are so far removed now from the whole process. In comparison to this, we have very little responsibility other than the material acquisition. So the archive was going to come to the museum, and clearly we could provide that engagement opportunity for the community. The site itself wasn't deemed important enough to be preserved, and it was built over. So completely different kind of experience. Anyway, just to go back to our little kind of like run through of what the experience was, the public airing of differences between the different kinds of archaeologists. So the consequences of rescue archaeology in the 1970s and the approaches to dealing with the consequences of all that rescue archaeology dominates all the topic of conversations in the 70s and the 80s in our newsletters. In 1986, the SMA newsletter said, SMA was recently at a meeting of the Standing Conference of Archaeological Unit Managers to discuss the possibility of preparing in association with SMA and UKIC, which is our ICON, a series of criteria for excavation units on the preparation of excavation archives for the deposit in approved museums. So that newsletter was written the same year that I went to work in Bristol. And 2 years later, the draft paper that came out of that conversation was discussed. Concern was expressed over the lack of consultation with museums inherent throughout the document. The matter is being pursued. So if we shoot forward to what is actually happening today, of all the museums that we have surveyed, over 80% of them have those guidelines for deposition of archaeological archives, but they didn't derive from one particular set of guidelines. They all grew up piecemeal. They all share, they have common characteristics. They share standards, so standards have been produced. And whereas SMA probably started off as a organisation that had a political voice, it very soon transformed into one that needed to respond to the process by producing standards by which it could be carried out. And of course, one of those standards was never that we should all have the boxes that are the same size that go in our stores, which is a real niggle for most people, particularly units. So, I just thought I'd show you the tip of the iceberg of what started to happen, largely as a result of austerity. So in terms of the political voice and trying to stand up for our subject, we started to get letters in, so particularly in response to museums that were being closed, also jobs that were being put together. So you'll notice my title now is Curator of Archaeology and World Cultures, because that's what happened to me this year. 2 departments were put into one. Reading Museum faces funding cuts, so Reading Museum's Archaeologist was made redundant, and the collection is now curated by a natural scientist and maybe not anymore. We've got no idea what was going on in Guildford. Museums became financially unviable. National Museum Wales boss, so it goes on. You know, this was a countrywide phenomenon, and we were getting lots and lots of requests for information. So the recurring themes throughout all of this, these are all the problems that we've been trying to deal with, and obviously I haven't got time to deal with all of those in the time allotted to me today. So I just thought I would concentrate on one of the areas that we've been working really hard on. And that's to do with working with other organisations across the archaeology sector. So this expresses it. There are lots of different types of expertise that are required. And what this gentleman said just here, Mark Davis, who was the Colchester Museum's curator at the time, basically museum archaeologists seem to always be on the end of whatever ball somebody else starts rolling. And that's still true. And these, just to give you an idea of our sector-wide reach, and also a little bit about the fragmentation across the sector of who does what. This is some of the icons of some of the organisations that I correspond with on behalf of SMA. And I've got to say, knowing all of these organisations is to our advantage. And the one thing that I would impress upon people is that working together gets a better message across. If we share all of our problems with each other, then we get those people to speak on our behalf. So somebody's already mentioned today the initiative that CEF has been carried out, the 21st Century Challenges in Archaeology, which is one project that we participated in. That's looking at new models for deposition, creation, storage, access. We've been looking at the rationalisation of archaeological collections as a project. Historic England, I've got to say, have been a stalwart in terms of funding a lot of this research. It is my contention that the fact that archaeological archives were specifically mentioned in the Mendoza Review of Museums was largely as a result of the wider sector groups speaking up on behalf of museums, not necessarily what the Society of Museum Archaeology said. It was because other people were making recommendations. So we have no direct input into the rate that things are being collected. This was my store when it looked really tidy one day, so I thought I'd just share a nice picture of it, because if you ever come to Bristol, it doesn't look like that at the moment, because we are absolutely moving things around in order to be able to acquire more. I am fortunate. Our doors are still open for collecting in Bristol. So this is what was said. This is the year after PPG 16. So PPG 16, the consequences for museums are really plain to see. 25 years plus of this approach was celebrated in Historic England's publication, Building the Future, Transforming the Past. And that largely dealt with the positive outcomes of the developer-led process in England and the advancement of knowledge. But quite a lot of those archives that have been produced as a result of that process have nowhere to live. And there is a struggle to find places for them to live. And there's also been no fundamental philosophical debate about what we're doing, why we're doing it, who we're doing it for, and should we still be doing it the same way. And that is the issue. In 2012, this was produced on behalf of SMA and the Federation of Archaeological Managers and Employees, and funded by, then it was English Heritage. What it did was to address what the issue was. So there were two reports that went together, and at that particular time it discovered, for example, there were 47 local authorities for which there was nowhere to deposit an archive that had been produced as part of the developer funded process. There were lots of solutions that had been put forward to try and solve the problem, including regional storage facilities, how different institutions might share spaces. The flip side of it was that where there was no museum to put an archive, the units were having to hold on to them. So in 2012, the estimate was that there were 9,000 archaeological archives in England alone that had nowhere to be, which meant they are not publicly accessible. They are kept in a unit store at the expense of the unit. And the beauty of them when they're in a museum store is clearly somebody is providing that public accessibility, and that's something that I'm going to come on to very shortly. We have learned very quickly that it is our responsibility, wherever possible, to answer those calls for evidence. And if it wasn't for the work that we'd done with the other sector-wide bodies, particularly under the umbrella of the Archaeology Forum, that we wouldn't know. I wouldn't have been enabled to be able to even know that I could write this response to an inquiry, and to actually point out this fundamental disconnect between what the National Planning Policy Framework says and the statutory or lack of statutory responsibility to deal with the consequences. So, if you'd like to read our reports, so far 2 of them have been published, and there are some stark readings. We needed to have some kind of data with which to back up our arguments about what was going on and what was going on in terms of space. So I've just got the 3rd year results in, and the numbers aren't crunched, so these are actually last year's. But the most fundamental thing is most museums have less than 5 years worth of space before they run out. That those which have estimates have less than 20 cubic metres of space to store all of this material. The number one reason for stopping collecting this material was because they were running out of space. And then the drop in archaeological expertise. So we asked a specific question between 2012 and now, how many people like me have gone from your museum? And you can see that only 57% of them said that anybody with any kind of expertise in the care of archaeological archives were employed in those museums. We've tried to get this information out. We've been passing it across the wider sector in whatever format. We've been pressing our case about what we actually do. We've started to work together with the other subject specialist networks. So we've created an SSN Consortium because we realise that in terms of expertise, it's in our own interest to work with the other subject specialist networks because they have similar problems. We speak with a louder voice when we speak together. How do we deal with it? So in 1991, obviously there is a training issue. If there are fewer people like me in the industry, then there are fewer of us that can pass on our expertise to others, and we need to find a way to ensure that we can do that. We've provided lots and lots of standards, so we are producing lots of electronic resources. We've come up with a new strategy. Should we be successful, we've applied to the Subject Specialist Network funding stream this time for a whole programme of reviewing all of our standards in the guidance of care of collections, which will be electronic resources, training sessions within the regions, and more importantly, mentoring between those who are expert and non-expert curators. We've responded to some of the calls for getting rid of things. One of the things that we get asked a lot of the time is, don't you have too much stuff? Haven't you got somewhere that you can throw it all away? And the answer is, we did a big survey. We have 5 case studies ranging from Museum of London, largest urban archaeological archive in the world, right down to a very small museum with no expertise. And we can tell you that it is possible to do, but it's going to cost you a very lot of money. It's going to take an awful amount of time. It doesn't create as much space as you think it will. And it certainly won't solve the crisis in terms of the space that we want. We responded together to the Mendoza review. So Historic England put together a task and finish group of which SMA was involved. And it came up with a new plan, and you can read that plan and some of the recommendations which were all accepted by the Department of Culture, Media and Sport. What I've got to say is that response to Mendoza has had a long gestation in the fact that we have been working together to get to the point to be able to articulate similar messages. And that was really important. And one of the most important things as far as museums were concerned was we were able to produce a description of what a publicly accessible repository for archaeological archives. Note, we don't call it a museum. So that is a specific reference to what it says in the footnote of the NPPF about where archives should be. It's either a local museum or publicly accessible depository. And what we've said is those depositories are only accessible if there is somebody there who knows what to do with them. This is not about putting them in a hole in the ground and bring them out like a library. These have to be something which is facilitated by people who know how to do this. That is the skill of the museum archaeologist and people who work in museums. So the question is, does this look like a museum? And the answer is, yes, it does, but not always. Thank you.
So today I've been asked to address the topic of planning for people from an Arts Council perspective. Given that I'm talking to a room of archaeologists, I've made the potentially dangerous assumption you were thinking of living people, and therefore I'm going to share our current thinking about how we connect with more communities in more places. So the Arts Council exists at arm's length from government, but receives both taxpayer and lottery money from which we use to support a huge swathe of cultural activity up and down the country. The taxpayer bit, of course, has been squeezed since 2010 as part of the government's austerity programme, but not as much as local authority income, which is another key income stream for cultural organisations. All the work we do is guided by our 10-year strategy, which is about to run out in 2020, and more on that later. Our strategy has 3 goals which address funding the highest quality work, making sure it reaches the most people possible, and particularly engaging children and young people. But we also have 2 supporting goals which address the health of the cultural sector, how well run are cultural organisations, and how diverse and skilled are the people who work in them. So how does any of this relate to the world of archaeology? Well, of course, first and foremost, we're responsible for developing and funding a range of museums in England, many of which store and display archaeological material that's of great public benefit, both in terms of academic research and for museums' audiences. From 3D printing of objects in Lincolnshire to living history as part of the Neolithic collection as part of Whole City of Culture, or even a celebration of Hadrian's cavalry that spanned the entire length of Hadrian's Wall last year. We're supporting a wide range of exciting work. And we also have a range of other responsibilities, including statutory functions, of course, around the protection of cultural property. And we concern ourselves with many aspects of museums' development. For example, we're currently working with Historic England to address museums' capacity to care for archaeological material from building sites. But I want to spend most of this talk focusing on the big picture of cultural policy as a whole. And when I use the term culture in a speech, it should be taken to include all the activity we currently support across the arts, museums and libraries. And when I use the word creative practitioner, I am including curators and other relevant staff within that umbrella term. A challenge I think we all share in common is the desire to engage the wider public with the wonder of objects and experiences, both for their direct pleasure and their enrichment, but also to win their support for the indirect benefits of, for example, research collections. But my main focus today is on that direct public benefit, because despite the efforts of many at the Arts Council and in the cultural sector, we've still a way to go to fully realise the creative and cultural potential of the nation. I think we could still plan a lot better for people. I'll start with some high-level observations about the state of the nation and how all policymakers, not just cultural ones, are thinking about it. And then I'll go on to talk in a bit more detail about the evidence base in relation to public engagement with culture. And I'll finish with how we're developing our next 10-year strategy. So, an enthusiastic amateur when it comes to museums and objects, I was fascinated to read your colleague Brenna Hassett's book, Built on Bones, and to discover how, through bioarchaeology, we can build up a story about the inequalities and divisions of societies in the past. But let's dwell for a minute on what the sociologists and the political scientists are telling us about the present, about how the country's currently thinking and feeling, and what the deep drivers of those attitudes are. This is, of course, the context for all current public policy, but I'll talk about some of those specific attitudes later in relation to cultural policy. The impact of globalisation on the nation's economic and social geography has been playing out over decades, but the 2008 crash, subsequent austerity, and the Brexit vote have brought those divisions into much sharper focus. It's troubling the politicians that the people who are losing out are starting to reject the political status quo of the last 40 years. Now, different academics cut the cake differently, but all of the analysis points to tribes forming in society based on people's relative exposure to economic forces. Analysis of British election survey data by Will Jennings and Jerry Stoker from Southampton show how people in thriving metropolises tend to be more open on issues like immigration and the rule-based global order. But they identify a second group, often people from coastal towns and deindustrialised regions, who've lost out to globalisation and are much more likely to be negative about issues like immigration and the EU. So, of course, it's not all a big city, small town phenomena. For example, LSE's Mike Savage argues that not everyone in the cities has it good, and he's identified the emerging precariat of gig workers and the like who are struggling in the cities. So whether we as policymakers think of these trends as a complicated splintering or a great divide between haves and have-nots, they have to be of concern. And in my world, we can't ignore that these attitudes are associated with levels of cultural engagement. It's a lovely correlation. This is some analysis of data by Mark Taylor of Sheffield University that shows the association between arts engagement and the EU referendum vote. At one extreme, we have metropolitan Westminster, full of theatres and opera houses and Remain voters. And at the bottom end, there's Blackburn and Darwin, which has the lowest level of officially captured cultural engagement in the country and a strong leave vote. So if the macro question is how can public policy respond to the needs of everyone in society, not just the winners from globalisation, the question for the Arts Council is how do we respond to everyone's cultural needs and wants. So I mentioned earlier that we're very much in planning mode towards our next 10-year strategy, which will guide our activity through to 2030. This is very much an evidence-based exercise, and for the next few slides I'm picking out a small selection of some pertinent evidence points that we've used in our analysis. For those of you who are interested, I direct you to the much more substantial complete material on our website, which consists of an evidence review of over 100 reports, and also includes the findings from a conversation earlier in this year in which we heard from both stakeholders but also critically a representative 5,000 members of the public. And what we wanted from that conversation phase was a deeper understanding of how the public define culture and what they value about it. So what have we heard from that conversation with the public? Are they happy with cultural provision? Are we failing to meet their needs? The public have rich cultural lives, but they don't necessarily think what they do as arts and culture. They tend to define the arts through a tight prism of opera, ballet and classical music. In terms of the publicly funded offer, they often don't know what's on in their local area. The public see what happens in London as important, especially for our international reputation, but they also want culture that reflects their community. They want digital opportunities to engage, but they also value physical spaces. They don't want museums to become obsolete. The conversation with the public and our stakeholders sets up an interesting tension that we must grapple with. The public thinks it's more important to get more people engaged with culture than to focus on making the very best culture. This is in contrast to professionals in the cultural sector who don't want the focus on excellence diminished. How do we interpret and resolve that tension through cultural policy? In starting to address that question, I'll turn to what the evidence base has to say about excellence and culture. And here I would say there's a question of language and definition. I think the word excellence tends to be associated with certain types of culture, the traditional Western canon, if you like. As policymakers, we need to think broadly, not narrowly. I'm going to talk about how we think about quality, which I think is a word with less baggage. This is important because how we define quality influences the type of culture that receives public investment. Of course, one way to measure culture is via a set of standards determined by experts. For example, the Arts Council does that for museums' collections via its designation scheme. Broadly speaking, evidence suggests that the public who participate, visit or attend publicly funded culture tend to think the quality of what they see is really very high. However, there's considerable evidence that certain types of culture, for example, Black British contemporary music, that's marginalised and stigmatised through discussions of quality and excellence. Within the cultural sector and the academic community, there's a continued debate about whether and how quality can be measured. A key emerging challenge is establishing what quality looks like in the realms of participatory culture or everyday creativity, such as evaluating what happens in a museum project where work is co-curated with the public. Work to measure the impact of participation seeks to consider the value of process, not just the outcome. Indicators of quality in this context might include the relevance of the experience to participants, the rigour in delivery, what's drawn from the content, and the captivation or challenge created. How to evaluate the quality of cultural activity will remain a topic of debate, but I think the cultural sector is moving on from the assumption that quality is something that can be wholly determined by a narrow set of tastemakers and gatekeepers. So let's look at some of the empirical evidence and research that we've also assembled. And I've selected some material specifically around museums. Do museums' audiences look like our increasingly diverse, living, breathing contemporary society, or are they in danger of ossifying? The DCMS survey, Taking Part, is the ONS measure of cultural engagement, the official measure. Taking Part shows that since 2010, museums' audiences have got bigger, but they've also got proportionately richer and whiter. Overall, half of adults in England engaged with a museum or gallery in the past 12 months, which is a 6 percentage point increase across all demographics since 2010. But the increase in engagement by people from lower socioeconomic groups has been smaller than that of the better off. And when it comes to people of colour, we've seen a significant decline in attendance from this group over that period. Museums do better in terms of diversity of their audiences compared to some art forms, but their audiences are significantly less representative of society when compared with libraries, which is the part of the Arts Council's footprint that most successfully reaches less advantaged groups. Focus group research shows that perceptions remain that museums are stuffy and uninviting. These figures suggest some worrying inequality in engagement with established institutions, but the figures themselves obscure some more of the reality of cultural engagement. Taking Part has been criticised for only capturing a narrow range of the public's cultural consumption. So I also want to briefly address some of the evidence and analysis that digs more deeply into the issue of who is and isn't engaging and why. Many recent studies, including work by my colleague, Professor Belfiore, point to the very deep engagement people have with culture that isn't officially captured or necessarily supported by public money. The question we as a public funder have to ask ourselves is whether we are creating dubious hierarchies of cultural value by funding some types of culture over others. The evidence suggests the low levels of attendance by certain groups for publicly funded culture is not simply about access, but due to a mismatch between what's on offer and what people actually want. Why should Pakistani women in Gateshead visit craft exhibitions if the crafts have no cultural relevance to them? Others point to the importance of experience in childhood and at school as critical in forming tastes and perceptions. So look, I've given you a very small sample of some of the evidence, particularly focused on museums and museums' audiences. Time's preventing me from covering all of the relevant material informing our strategy, but you'll see in the next section of my talk about how the wider body of evidence has been informing our thinking. We're right in the middle of that process, so I'm very much sharing work in progress. Our new strategy is about building on what's good and changing what isn't working. So let me start briefly with some positives. Over the past 10 years, we've demonstrated a growing national and international reputation for the quality and innovation of our creative industries, including our publicly funded cultural organisations. We've cultural buildings that are now better able to meet the complex demands of our audiences and our creative talent, and have become more attractive and accessible. And as a result, many cities and towns across England have greatly strengthened their cultural offer compared with a decade ago. Apologies, my footprint only covers England, but that is also true of the wider United Kingdom. But the evidence shows that some things need to change. And our case for change is made up of 6 key areas that I'm going to talk you through. Firstly, as I've already alluded to, there are significant differences in how arts and culture are defined, understood, and valued. Many people consider the arts to mean high art and say as a result that they don't feel any sense of connection to it. Most people have active cultural lives, and their definition of culture is broad, including activities such as cooking, gardening, or watching content on a mobile phone, alongside visits to arts organisations, museums and libraries. But the frequency of people's experience in publicly funded culture is still greatly shaped by their social, economic and educational backgrounds. Evidence shows that most children and young people take part in cultural activity that stimulates their creativity. A lot of this happens in their own time and increasingly online. The cultural activities children take part in strongly determine the choices they make as they get older. And the preschool years seem to be particularly influential in shaping cultural activity. For some children, school provides the first opportunity for cultural activity, and that experience can act as a social leveller. Without this experience of access, the gap in the levels of cultural activity that children experience widens further. And we know that the place of culture in the curriculum is coming under increasing pressure in many schools. And there also appears to be limited recognition amongst many parents, carers, children and young people of the broader value of studying cultural subjects at school. In addition to these three audience-focused arguments for change, there are also related points I'm going to make about the state of our cultural organisations. The makeup of publicly funded organisations does not currently reflect today's society. Access for people from ethnic minorities, disabled people, and people from economically disadvantaged backgrounds is still limited. And I've been reading some blogs about the archaeological community and finding that a similar pattern exists amongst you as well. In some leadership roles, particularly in our larger organisations, women continue to be underrepresented. And of course, this lack of diversity has a wider effect on how these organisations are run, ultimately dictating what culture's made and which audiences are reached. Cultural organisations use a wide variety of business models, but too few could be described as dynamic enough or fit for purpose for the changing environment of the next 10 years, the pressures on funding or the need to respond to new technology and the use of data. And finally, people working in publicly funded cultural organisations report that partly because of pressure on public funding over the last 10 years, more and more organisations are tending to play safe and are commissioning work from too narrow a range of creative practitioners. Reduced risk-taking and innovation may lead, in the end, to stagnation within cultural organisations. So, we've taken this evidence-based case for change and built a set of outcomes. These outcomes are the subject of a live consultation which is open until the new year. We're focusing on outcomes at this stage because we want to establish a shared ambition across all of our stakeholders, something we can all agree on, and have a conversation about what the best way might be to achieve those outcomes. Let me quickly summarise them. We want a nation that supports and celebrates culture and creativity of every kind. People from every background to benefit from public investment in culture. Creative R&D and talent development to be flourishing, and that England's diversity is fully reflected in the organisations we support. And that the creative and cultural lives of all children and young people are recognised and nurtured. Cultural organisations are dynamic, focused on the future and relevant. And as England continues to increase its global reputation for the quality of its creative industries. So to sum up, what I've shared with you today is not a strategy. It's not even a draft strategy. It's instead a group of outcomes we'd like to see linked to what the evidence is telling us. After we've consulted on these outcomes, we'll transform them into a set of goals that will shape our future investment, development and advocacy activity. But by 2030, we intend that this country should become a truly creative nation, one that celebrates the culture of all its communities, and one that fosters creativity in everyone throughout their lives. To achieve this, it means the Arts Council will have to change. And it means we will need to form more alliances nationally and locally, especially among local authorities and higher education institutes. If we manage to do that, we believe we'll witness a flourishing of creativity that surpasses anything yet achieved in our history. I hope that's given you a sense of where we are It may have inspired you. If so, please do join the current consultation at the address on this slide. Thank you.
The tea break's not now, I'm sorry, you've got me to listen to and then there's tea break, so I'll try and be fast. My name's John Martin, I'm the Artistic Director of Pan Intercultural Arts, and I've been wondering why I was invited here. It was not immediately obvious to me unless Hannah had secretly rung members of my family and found out that I wanted to be an archaeologist when I was a young teenager. I made the bath dirty. I spent Sundays wandering at low tide in the mud around Canvey Island, picking up bits of broken pottery which had been part of the salt pans which created salt for Roman England. All those things. That was Sunday. Saturdays I was in a dance studio training to be a ballet dancer. Yeah. Finally the ballet won. And then that turned into theatre and that turned into what I'm doing now. But somewhere the archaeology is still in there. I'm trying to get my boys interested too. So I'm used to sort of dark spaces like this in theatre, so it's a bit of a second home to me. So maybe this is why I'm here. But also I've been thinking through the day on the profile, the panorama of the day. And we started with open spaces, big old buildings. We went to big cities and what they're doing for the economy. We then came around to people and the public, and slowly coming down towards just people themselves. And I work with people, not the public. I work with individuals. I spend day in, day out working with individual people. So Pan is a group of highly trained, highly passionate, highly expert facilitator artists who work with very, very, very disadvantaged people. I'm going to describe some of them, but I thought to get going, rather than show you yet another PowerPoint, I'm just going to show you some pictures of faces. These are some of the people that we work with. Of the 10,000 people we've worked with over the last few years. So, I'll try and make a bridge before I get into this between museums, archaeology and the work that I do. If you walk into the beautiful, amazing new World Gallery at the very special Hana Morel Museum in South East London, near where I live, you will see a number of things in there which are very different from what was there before. One of them is a bit of an old boat. It's dug up and cut free of a number of old boats and put into the part on the Mediterranean. It was a boat which used to be an Algerian fishing boat. It then became a boat which carried refugees across the Mediterranean. That already is pretty effective and impressive. They put that in a museum about world culture. But they went further. They said, we want this to have a voice. So they called us up and we took in some of our young refugees, the more mature ones who could reflect on this, who had made the crossing across the Mediterranean, who had lost their friends, who'd come from war, and who could think back about the boats they came across on. There's a video beside the exhibit which shows the workshops we did about the Mediterranean's history, how this is the latest part of migration across it, perhaps the most tragic, we don't know. And then they made a poem about the boat. These are people who've spent time with us coming out of trauma into creativity. And they made the most extraordinary poem, which was in the voice of the boat. The boat speaks about what it saw, what it did, what it carried, who it carried, and the sadness and the grief inside it. So the Hana Morel and Pan have come together on this. Museums and this fairly edgy art at the edge of the social divide. Of course, if I'm going to talk about people, let's just get people and culture and heritage worked out a little bit. It is, of course, community is about people, culture is about people. Everything we talked about today is only there. Someone said this. The woodlands are no good if there are no people to appreciate them. The buildings are no good if there's no one to actually see it and value it and give it its value. And in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it says, Article 27, everyone has the right to freely participate in the cultural life of the community, to enjoy the arts and to share in scientific advancement. So culture is something we share. A culture is something which binds us together. Culture is something which strengthens us and we celebrate. Everyone in this room pretty much shares a culture. shares a culture of the city we live in, of how we've been brought up, of values. And yet, people I work with day in, day out, if I brought them to the front door of this building, they would turn around, they would leave. They don't feel this building welcomes them. They don't feel the Royal Festival Hall welcomes them. They don't feel the Tate Britain welcomes them. And I've taken them to all these places and say, we're not allowed in there, are we? And part of my job is to say, yes, you are. And part of my job is to bring them in. If they came into this debate, they would say, get me out of here. This is not for me. Now that's a real challenge, because I believe that these people need the arts to contact with their own culture and their own heritage, and to bring that into this culture and heritage so that we make a new hybrid culture and heritage, because that's what London, the UK, is and has been for thousands of years. So to keep those people on the outside, it's not good for them, it's not good for us either. So how are we going to do this? Well, first of all, we have to understand that everyone who comes from a culture outside of the UK brings another culture with them, another heritage with them. We have to value that. It's where the Heritage Lottery Fund is so good. They say, yes, of course, the stories from the Mahabharata or the Ramayana that the Indian people bring into this country is part of our culture. The toys which people played with in Iran before they came as refugees are part of their heritage and our culture. So we've got to recognise their culture, but there's also got to be a way of introducing them to this culture. What is this funny big city they live in? I'm doing a project with some at the moment about the history of restaurants. London restaurants. We went around Covent Garden the other day. We counted 145 restaurants we walked past in 50 minutes. Some of the people I was with came from towns where there was not a single restaurant. Just imagine the cultural gap that they have to overcome to understand living in London. Okay, who are these people I'm talking about? I and my companions work with unaccompanied minor asylum seekers who come from war zones, from torture, from prejudice, from drought, from famine, without their parents, of course. Young adult refugees who've had similar journeys, but often they have been caught up in the fighting, they have been the fighters, they've lost parts of their body in the war, they've spent months, if not years, on the road, on the water to get here. We work with women who have been trafficked into this country. Women who have been bought by people in the UK, like objects, either for the sex trade or for domestic slavery, in which they're locked up for 16 hours of the day, let out to clean, and then locked up again for the rest of the day. When they get out, when they escape or they're busted out, one of the places they come to is us, and we help them rehabilitate themselves through the arts. I'll talk about that in a minute. We work with young people in pupil referral units. We work with people in youth offending services who carry knives, for whom carrying a knife is not just a cool thing to do, it's essential. They will say, it's essential I carry that knife, otherwise I might die. That's something we also have to unpick, challenge, reflect on. How do you get people to reflect? Get them using their imagination, get them creative. So we have one person, I think I quoted him in my bio. I was working with someone over the summer. We were talking about what could it be that you could become, what are the role models, what are the directions. I don't need to think about that, bruv, because I'm going to die before I'm 20. What do you mean you're going to die before you're 20? I'll be shot down on my estate. That for him is a truism. Got to unthink that and make him realise there are other ways, other routes in there. This takes a lot of time to make them realise that culture's got something for them. All those people I've just described. They're all two things. One, tragically, all suffering from PTSD of some kind in different emanations, different presentations, and they're all human beings. That's the great thing. They're not refugees forever. They're not trafficked women forever. They're human beings with potential. The arts and culture is one way of bringing that potential out of them, if you've got a lot of time, a lot of passion, a lot of compassion, and a lot of skill. At the moment, at PAN, we give more than 250,000 contact hours per year to get these people back on the road. Underlying all this is why would they want to get involved with us? Well, when the basic fears are sorted, where am I going to sleep tonight, what am I going to eat tonight, am I safe, there is a human desire to communicate, human desire to imagine. Trauma closes it down, but it's still there. The average refugee wants to get out of the circle of fear and the anaesthesis which trauma brings, wants to get out of the tyranny of awful memories, which continually revisit, wants to get out of anywhere uncomfortable, mentally or physically. The youth involved in street crime doesn't want to die at 20. If they're shown there's another way, they want to get that way, they want to leave that behind them. If we can do that, they can have fear-free lives. They can become full potential human beings. They can contribute to society, and our societies become better. I wanted to ask our friend from Wales what the social return on investment was. Has Cardiff become a safer space? Is there less crime? Are there less teenage pregnancies? Because if not, all of that is wasted. It's got to have that. That's the social return through the arts. So when they come to us, I'm not going to describe every single thing we do, except to say we work through theatre, through dance, through video, through singing in choirs, things which give them a sense of ownership of their work, a sense of trust, a sense they have something to bring. For example, in the choir, they bring their own songs from their own cultures, they teach them to other people. This is a choir of trafficked women. When they come to us, they're timid, fearful. I don't actually see them, they work only with female facilitators until the end of the year with us. At the end of the year, they've brought their own material and they're celebrating it with us. In fact, I'll cut straight through to some examples of how this works. Just picture the scene. 3-4 weeks ago, Turner Prize exhibition opened in Tate Britain. One of the previews, the guests were wandering in, picking up their glasses of wine, about to go through and see the Turner Prize, and this beautiful sound came up around the Devine galleries. One of the most beautiful things I've ever heard. And it was a choir of trafficked women. No one knew they were trafficked women. It was a choir. I knew they were trafficked women. Singing songs that they had created, and their music was just swirling around as people came in, and people stopped and said, "What is that?" When we took them about a week before to the gateway, the portico, the dome of Tate Britain, said, "We can't go in there. I won't know what to do in there. How do I behave? How do I dress?" They had no idea you can just walk in. They had no idea it was free. But after a week, they were singing for 400 people inside there. That's the kind of advance that we give through our work. They bring their heritage, we introduce them into a building which is our heritage, and they create something new and different in that space. Another quick story. Knock, knock, knock on the door of my office, just over in Russell Square. Young man walks in. "Hi, John, haven't seen you for 2 years." This is a young Afghan refugee. When he came to us, he spoke no English. He had travelled for 3 years in the backs of trucks, eating dry biscuits and water, pretty much nothing else. He'd been imprisoned in Turkey. He'd walked over the mountains to get into Turkey from Iran. He'd capsized in the Mediterranean. He'd been through everything you can imagine. He'd seen friends die there a lot. He came to us, and the traffickers had said, "Tell this story when you get in, that'll get you." I think he'd told so many stories, he didn't know which story was true anymore. He then got into trouble with the police for shoplifting. He came to our project week after week after week and started to calm, started to write, started to speak English, started to make scenes, make effects, make sculptures for us. And then he got a place in art school, and he disappeared. That's success for us. When we don't see them anymore, it's success. They've gone. They're their own people now. They're independent. So he comes back in, sits down with me and says, "John, I'll make the tea. I want to talk to you about Jasper Johns." An Afghan refugee from the war, the first person in his family ever to be literate, is now talking about Jasper Johns. Well, what about Jasper Johns? About the way he treated the American flag. You know those things where you see the newspaper text coming through the flag? And I want to make work about that for the Afghan flag and the British flag. I want those to be my finals piece next year. Will you advise me? And you think, shit, it was worth it. Someone's come through, someone's actually getting a life out of this, and the arts have given him that bridge, that walkway through to it. There's so many stories like this, and I can't go through them all, except perhaps just one very, very quick one to say there's another very troubled young man who's from Albania, in trouble in school, excluded all the time, on detention all the time, is violent in school. Turns up every Thursday night to Central St Martin's where we run our refugee workshop. And from being, again, fairly timid, he now writes poetry for us. He tells us that he plays the violin. He brings the violin and plays it. This is not a troublemaker. It's not someone who turns up late. This is someone who, given the right environment, can bring what is valuable to him into a space and share it. And isn't that a good definition of culture? And he wrote a poem, and at the end of it, which we used in a performance quite recently, he said, "In the end, they saw a green light, the light which was giving them life. That small light became a sun. The sun was putting them back alive. They made everything like a team. Pan is a team. Everything we want, we can make it only if we become a team." I thought, and you are being threatened with expulsion from a school? You're brilliant. Somehow, his relationship with institutions and schools doesn't work. His relationship with us does. So, final one. Fatuma, lovely young lady from Sierra Leone, was shipped out quickly by an aunt when she was about to be married. She was 14, the husband-to-be was 54. She was shipped out just literally the night before the marriage. She was given refugee status here. Couldn't speak any African language, couldn't speak English, only spoke French. We had to speak with her in French for the first 2 years. As part of a project, we took her to the Museum of London, the Museum of Transport. Not the one in Covent Garden, the one out in Ealing, where they have all the big locomotives and trains. And she was only speaking French at this time, and I was chatting to her in French, and she said, in translation obviously, she said, "This is amazing. Here, you have buildings where you can visit your own history." I thought, what a wonderful thing for her to discover. A museum is a place where you can visit your own history and build a relationship to it. She had no idea of it. She's now a leading student at Lewisham College. English is perfect. She'll be a nurse in a couple of years' time. Again, these are the success stories. Of course, they're not all success stories, but it does work when we respect their background and when we introduce them to the background here. Now, with all this, we don't get much time to think about policy. We're too busy taking stories home, sharing them. I have stood bail for someone due for deportation. One of my colleagues was the birth partner for a trafficked woman giving birth because she had no one to give birth to. These are not things that artists normally have to do. We're constantly involved. So a couple of years ago we thought, no, we've got to use all this experience and start to let other people know. And it really started when we spent 2 weeks in the jungle in Calais, working with migrants there and realizing how powerful the storytelling that they gave us was. Very briefly, I say, what they loved performing for us was what had happened to them last night. They'd been out, they'd climbed the razor wire, they'd got over the first lot of razor wire. As they got up the second lot of razor wire, police dogs came, pulled them down. The gendarmes came, hit them, gassed them, put them in a van, drove them 40 kilometres out of town and dumped them. They walked back and came to the session the next day and acted it out for us. But the ability to act it out, the ability to say, this is what happened to me. They didn't go and lie down and feel sorry for themselves. They wanted to come and tell their story. At this point, we said, we've got to start telling the stories too. Oh, I didn't know there was a 5-minute sign came. It's very good down here. It's very well organised. So we decided we've got to start thinking about this. If you look at our website, there's a short piece we did with Jon Snow, which was broadcast about our work. We have started doing podcasts about what's needed in this sector, why this sector works, why it needs to be invested in. We join all the groups, and this is where policy becomes frustrating. So Home Office rings us up and says, you work with young people with knives and guns, and you try and get them to reimagine their futures. Come and talk to us. We need your advice. So my colleague goes and sits with them, maybe a couple of other organisations. They talk about what they do in the Home Office. Say, this is fantastic. But we want something which can get results within a year. These people have got dreadful, dreadful lives and no role models on which to base a way out of the labyrinth. You can't do it in less than a year. So they write up these papers, they include our comments and say, this will need 10 years of investment, at least, in order to get a generation thinking differently, because the peer pressure is so huge otherwise. Similarly, the London riots happened. Within a week, money was being thrown at the problem. Please, if you're doing work in that little area of West Euston or that little area of Haringey, come to us, I've got money for you. And these are the people who are liable to create problems next summer when it comes around, so please stop them doing it by involving them in a project. But the money runs out after a year. Fortunately, it wasn't a long hot summer, it didn't happen, so we couldn't test the worth of the work. And even now, this year, a perceived spike in knife crime. So we get called up again by the police saying there's money available from all this fund, from Sadiq Khan, from the Home Office again. Please apply for it. But if you look at it, this came out I think in June, July, maybe May, June. They wanted measurable results by Easter. That is a policy. It's a policy which says, I need to show my voters I'm doing something about it. I don't want Sadiq Khan has no anti-crime policy. It's not a policy to help these young people out. If we're going to change the culture and include those people in our greater culture, so they're not scared by buildings like this, not scared by people like us, not scared by the Tate Britain, not scared by the Royal Festival Hall, we need time to do that. Time and investment. We've got skills, we've got passion, we're already seeding it in other cities across the UK, but we need the time. People have got to understand that social problems are not solved by the next election. They're solved several elections down the road. Long-term thinking is important. I think I had some wise words to finish with. See if I can still remember them. Or find them. There's a couple of quotes. This is just the sorts of things that, if I can find them, people say, yeah, here, okay. Just a couple of quotes from people who work with us. Theatre literally is the only place I can feel heard. Theatre is the only place where everyone has a voice and everyone has a turn. No one, nowhere else. Theatre is the only place I've ever been heard. I come to Pan because I have fun. Pan is my second family. We find this being used about us a lot. We become a family to them. Our therapist thinks this is very wrong. Pan is my sanctuary. I come to Pan because the people there make me feel like home. Pan is my pillow. It's there for me when I need a hug and when I'm lonely. Last one. I want to say thank you very much indeed to all of you for your help and support during the sessions. It's given me such confidence in my abilities and taught me to believe in myself. In about 10 months' time, he will be graduating as a pharmacist. That was written 3 years ago when he got his place to go into pharmacy school. It can work, and it does work. And I want everyone to invest in it. Everyone. That's it. Thank you.
So I was involved with the development of MShed in Bristol. It's a museum about what makes Bristol Bristol. It's told through the eyes of ordinary people from the past and from the present day. And we made it very clear that when we were telling that story, we wouldn't avoid the challenging ones. So we do deal with prostitution. We do deal with the legacy of the transatlantic slave trade. We deal with tragedies. People connect with those negative stories in the same way as they will connect with the positive stories, because essentially they're about people and they empathise with them.
I understand that people do, but do policymakers, do politicians fear that?
Why should they fear something that engages people? You know, that museum has 500,000 visitors or more every single year that engage with those stories. What bigger story can we give to the policymakers about what we do mattering to those people?
I think there's two slightly different things that I take from your question. One is about, how does the Arts Council react in its funding decisions to kind of whether it was from positive or negative work by artists or museums. I think we're interested in whether it's good, not whether it's a positive or negative story. So I think that's a slightly different point from what public policy is about, which is solving problems in society, and really the politicians will respond to your ability to solve their problems for them, not whether it's a positive or negative kind of approach to it, if you like.
But there is, if I can probe a little further based on the point, there's been so much talk today of how do we sell heritage, how do we show that culture can bring people together and unite, but how can we then incorporate in that narrative also the acknowledgement that culture also separates? And actually, if you look at a lot of the properties that, are part of the National Trust would have been built with wealth that was created through the selling and buying of people. And, I am not particularly shocked that, say, the black community has some problems in enjoying the beautiful buildings. But at the same time, if you want to talk about the role and significance of those buildings, can you really whitewash their history? But at that point, then it becomes harder to sell to the general public, or does it?
Well, I mean, the point that I would make is that in order to engage everyone with this is our shared history. That includes the ugly parts as well as the beautiful parts, but it is shared. And in order to fully make the most out of the benefit that these places can give to us as a community or a nation, we need to understand the different experiences, the different histories, the different stories that are part of our collected shared history. I appreciate, and the really difficult part is not alienating those that might find that challenging. And that is really difficult, and that's something that we struggle with, we have to address. But it doesn't mean that it's not a real story that needs to be told. And
Absolutely, yeah.
There's an extent that I think, working through that is an important thing to try to do. And I think in terms of sort of the sell to public, to politicians and the public policy message is that if we can work through that, the benefits for the whole nation are significant and greater than the benefits that we experience now through not having addressed those stories, if that makes sense.
Oh, yes.
So you're working towards that bigger benefit for a larger population of people. And I'd just really quickly, the other thing I would say is that the comparison I was making earlier was with the natural environment, and of course around climate change, all the messages are quite negative and quite difficult to deal with. But I think there's a way that you can shape our engagement with it as a public policy in a positive sense, and you present a positive vision, which is to say, actually, this is surmountable. We can work to make improvements here. We acknowledge this is the situation, it's not good, but there is a positive vision in terms of change that can be seen, and that's the story in terms of the public policy story that I think is useful to focus on.
So just picking up on one thing that you said about how people don't engage with places that they don't find things in, there is an issue about representation. So the more that we strive to represent those individuals in those places, the more they become less, they become able to enter those places.
Can I just add one thing to that? Sorry. The two examples I gave, in the Cali Jungle, it was a very uncontrolled situation. They told whatever they wanted to tell. Here, we never ask people their stories. And they never tell their stories until they're ready to. So the people who told them for the Horniman exhibition were people who had time to reflect. Otherwise, there's a huge risk of re-traumatizing people by the telling of their story. On the other hand, they will willingly tell stories of how awful it is to be in London. The fourth trauma, the trauma of settlement. And the trauma of settlement is huge for them, and they will tell those stories because it's something in them now. They're not labeling themselves as, this happened to me, that happened to me, I'm a victim. They're saying, I'm having real problems here, because this and this and this is not happening. So I think those things will certainly go out and be effective, and mostly be against the Home Office. Project-based funding is dreadful. because you have to, you're halfway through it, you're applying for the extension of the project-based funding, or you're told, oh, we only will fund you for 3 years, you've got to find someone else. So having built you up, and you've just got it working, your funder then drops out and says, no, we can't fund for more than 3 years, goes somewhere else. So it means, and this is across the sector in the arts now anyway, and I'm sure the other sectors we're talking about here, more and more people and hours are being spent on getting the money than doing the work. Or at least relative to what it was a few years ago. But it's becoming increasingly difficult to raise money for the long-term kind of investment that you and I are talking about.
Religion, so religion is a protected characteristic under the Equality Act. So our concern from a policy point of view is making sure that we are not discriminating in our funding processes from any particular group because of their religion. So in that sense, what we do is we impact assess our processes to make sure that we don't have any unintended consequences that lead to discrimination. So that, from a policy point of view, that is our approach to religious groups. If an interesting cultural project comes into us that happens to have a religious dimension to it, and it is of sufficient quality and interest to fund, we would fund it. So I'll try and answer the different aspects of it. I think yes, we have to. I mean, I absolutely acknowledge the challenge around short-term funding when your project has long-term outcomes. It's really difficult, and I think that we've responded to date in a number of ways. I mean, there's a really interesting programme that's incredibly important to us called Creative People and Places, which is basically a living experiment that's with huge variety across the country of different consortia coming together on the ground to develop a sort of bottom-up programme of cultural engagement that's really about co-creation between communities and the cultural practitioners, if you like, and we've deliberately conceived that as a 10-year programme, giving some longevity and certainty to the consortia involved, and it's been running for about 5 or 6 years now, and we are really starting to see a meaningful increase in engagement where those programmes are taking place amongst people who are less engaged. So that is proving the benefit of a long-term model. I think the other aspect around risk that we are addressing is around funding individual practitioners, and we've recently opened a scheme that probably isn't big enough, because certainly we're seeing in terms of the number of people applying that there's only a sort of 10% success rate to date in that scheme for cultural practitioners of any kind to come in to ask for money to buy them time, in effect. So not to produce a project, a specific production or a specific exhibition, but to give them time to develop their practice. That scheme's called Developing Your Creative Practice. And I think that's at an early stage, but I think that is also an alternative way of funding and supporting people. Yeah, and I think that getting in on the ladder of funding is something that we have to think really hard about. I mean, I can't speak for HLF, so in terms of how their funding programmes sort of operate on the ground. For the Arts Council, I think that there is definitely a capacity building challenge on the ground to get people equipped to come in for our lowest level project grants, and that's really hard work, and we haven't got very many resources, but where we've really tried to work with communities, we found that we've had success in bringing them in for funding. So we would love to do more of it. It's kind of we're limited by resources. I think there's also sometimes a sense of, I mean, not to forget a big lottery fund that can then change the name to the community fund, aren't they? But they're big, also offer micro grants, which are often used for culture. So we're not actually the only people in this space offering kind of small grants for more community-based activity as well. And the barriers to application, obviously, for smaller grants are lower.
I mean, one thing I would say is that it's something that we see a bit in our sort of regions and local operations is, you know, we particularly for local partners and stakeholders, we see that there is sometimes a difficulty for them in terms of the skills and resource that they have to try and tap into some of the funds and grants and so forth. And I think that's where partnership can be really powerful. And it's something that we have done a bit in some places in the Trust at a local level, where you have a larger organisation that has skills, has resource, has experience, perhaps has a space that people might find valuable to hold community events or to have a place to undertake a cultural activity within a community, for example. I think that can be quite a powerful way of supporting sort of local heritage or sort of cultural activities on the ground. But partnership itself is something that can be challenging and takes time and resource on our end as well. So I think it's a good thing when done well. Yeah, and we see it, I mean, where we have done it, and it's one of those things that we want to do more of, but it is quite challenging on the ground. But it's great, it's a way of bringing an audience who perhaps don't feel that they identify with one of our places or one of our properties particularly. It can be a way of inviting them in and working with them to understand their stories, understand what value they might get in a place. So it can lead to sort of, you know, co-curation of an exhibition or a sort of, you know, partnership on an arts project or something like that. That can be a really powerful way of sharing. You know, we're talking about bringing new audiences, meeting new demand, you know, what people need on the ground. It can be a really good way of doing that. But as I said, it has challenges in practice too.
Thank you. That's an excellent question to end it, because it leads to think about what do we do next, which is the topic of the final panel.